It was just after midnight in Encino, California. The lights inside the house were dim, the neighborhood quiet, the kind of silence that feels ordinary until you realize how fragile it is. Inside, Phil Hartman, one of the most recognizable comedic voices in America, was asleep in his bed. Hours earlier, millions of people had known him as a master of satire, a performer who made chaos look effortless and laughter feel easy. Now, in this room, there was no audience, no punchline, only a man at rest, unaware that his life was about to end. What happened inside that house would stun Hollywood to its core. Not because Phil Hartman had enemies, scandals, or a reputation for danger, but because he didn't. This was not a story the industry thought it would ever have to tell. And yet, by morning, the headlines would describe a death so violent, so intimate, that it raised questions still debated decades later. How does a night that begins with drinks and conversation spiral into an irreversible tragedy? Why were warning signs missed, minimized, or misunderstood? And in those final hours when choices were made, words were spoken, and silence followed what really happened before the sound of gunfire shattered everything. Tonight, we slow time down. We return to the final hours of Phil Hartman's life, trace the invisible cracks beneath the surface, and step back through the moments that led to one of the most devastating nights in modern Hollywood history. When the news broke in the early hours of the 28th of May, 1998, it didn't spread like ordinary celebrity gossip. It hit like an aftershock. Radio stations interrupted programming. Morning news anchors struggled to maintain composure. In Hollywood offices, phones rang before sunrise, carrying the same sentence, repeated in disbelief: Phil Hartman is dead. For many, the first reaction was confusion. Phil Hartman was not known for excess or volatility. He wasn't tabloid material. He wasn't a headline chaser. He was known as reliable, disciplined, and quietly brilliant, the kind of performer producers trusted and audiences took for granted. His face and voice were everywhere, yet his private life remained largely invisible. As details emerged, shock turned into something darker. This wasn't a car crash. It wasn't an overdose. It wasn't a sudden illness. The report spoke of gunshots inside a family home, of a wife, of children asleep down the hall, of a scene so intimate that even seasoned crime reporters struggled to frame it in familiar language. By mid-morning, the story had eclipsed everything else. Entertainment news became crime news. Comedy became tragedy. The industry was forced to confront a brutal contradiction. A man who made his living shaping laughter had died in fear and violence. Inside the place meant to be safest, cast members from Saturday Night Live began issuing statements, many of them stunned into simplicity. There were no clever tributes, no ironic callbacks, just grief. On the set of NewsRadio, production halted. Crew members gathered in silence, some learning the news only when they arrived for work and saw people crying in hallways. The show would never be the same again. Fans reacted with disbelief that bordered on denial. Message boards filled with the same questions, asked again and again. Is this real? Are they sure? How could this happen to him? The absence of an obvious explanation made the loss feel unreal, like a cruel misunderstanding that might still be corrected. Almost immediately, another layer emerged, one that deepened the unease. This wasn't just a death, it was a murder-suicide. And with that realization came a flood of uncomfortable questions. About mental health, about substance abuse, about domestic tension hidden behind polite smiles, about how well anyone really knows the people they love. Hollywood had seen tragic endings before, but this one felt different. There was no distant hotel room, no late-night accident on a dark road. This happened at home, in the middle of the night, with no witnesses, only consequences. As the world tried to process what had happened, one thing became clear. To understand Phil Hartman's death, you couldn't start with the gunshots. You had to go further back, into the life he built, the pressures he carried, and the slow, almost invisible descent toward a night no one believed was possible. Long before Phil Hartman became a household name, before his voice echoed through television sets across America, his life followed a quieter, more uncertain path. Born in Ontario, Canada, and raised in California, Hartman did not grow up dreaming of stardom. He studied graphic design, a discipline built on precision, control, and patience traits that would later define both his comedy and his reputation in Hollywood. Comedy came to him gradually. In the 1,970 seconds, Hartman found his way into the Los Angeles improv scene, a world fueled by ego, competition, and late nights. There, he met performers who chased attention aggressively. Phil did the opposite. He listened, he observed, he refined. His humor wasn't loud. It was surgical. He became known as someone who could elevate any sketch, any scene, without demanding the spotlight. That reputation followed him to Saturday Night Live. When Hartman joined the cast, he was older than many of his peers. He wasn't reckless or rebellious. He arrived prepared, week after week. He played presidents, authority figures, corporate villains, and smug, know-it-alls characters built on control and composure. Behind the scenes, he was dependable, professional, almost invisible in an industry that rewards chaos. As his career flourished, so did his sense of responsibility. Hartman wasn't chasing fame for its own sake. He was building stability. He had been married before. He had learned, painfully, how fragile personal life could be when placed next to ambition. By the time he married Bryn Omdahl in the late 1,980 seconds, he was determined to build something solid, something normal. From the outside, it worked. They had children. They bought a home in Encino, a quiet neighborhood far from Hollywood's glare. Phil commuted to work, came home, and focused on being a father. He avoided the party culture that surrounded many of his peers. He didn't cultivate scandals. He didn't seek reinvention. But success brings its own pressures. By the mid-1,990 seconds, Hartman's career had reached a paradoxical stage. He was everywhere, yet rarely the headline. His voice was iconic, his performances praised, but the industry rarely centered him as a leading star. For someone who valued stability, that invisibility was both protection and burden. Inside the home, cracks began to form. Bryn struggled to find her own footing. Acting roles were sporadic. Career frustrations lingered. Over time, reports would surface of volatile arguments, jealousy, and emotional strain. Phil, known for avoiding conflict, often chose silence over confrontation. He believed in endurance, in patience, in riding out storms quietly. Friends later described him as someone who carried weight without complaint. He worked constantly. He provided. He tried to keep peace, but peace, when maintained through avoidance, can become fragile. And by the late 1,990 seconds, the life Hartman had built carefully, methodically, was beginning to feel like a balancing act. From the outside, Phil Hartman appeared safe, stable, unremarkable in the best way. But behind the calm surface, forces were moving that would soon collide. Forces shaped by ambition, resentment, chemical dependence, and emotional isolation. And as those forces gathered, the man who had spent his life controlling narratives on stage and screen was slowly losing control over the one that mattered most. By the time Phil Hartman entered the final years of his life, the contrast between his public image and his private reality had become stark. On screen, he embodied control authority figures, polished antagonists, voices that never cracked. At home, control was harder to maintain. What had once been quiet tension was hardening into something volatile. Bryn Hartman's struggles were no secret to those close to the family. She had battled substance abuse in the past, cycling through periods of sobriety and relapse. Friends would later say that cocaine, alcohol, and prescription medication were not abstract dangers in their household. They were recurring threats. Phil knew this. He had drawn boundaries. He had insisted on sobriety as a condition of their marriage. And for a time, it seemed to work. But addiction rarely follows linear rules. In the late 1990 seconds, those close to the couple noticed changes. Arguments became more frequent. The emotional temperature inside the house rose. Bryn's behavior grew erratic. Phil, once patient to a fault, began confiding in friends that the situation at home was becoming unbearable. He loved his children. He feared instability. And increasingly, he feared what would happen if things continued as they were. Around this time, reports emerged that Bryn was taking antidepressant medication alongside alcohol and cocaine. The combination raised concerns among those who understood the risks. Mood swings intensified. Paranoia surfaced. Arguments escalated quickly, then vanished behind closed doors. To outsiders, the family still looked intact. To those inside, the structure was weakening. Phil faced a familiar dilemma, one that countless people encounter but rarely speak about publicly. Leaving might protect him, but it could also fracture his children's lives. Staying might preserve the family unit, but at a cost he could no longer calculate. Friends later recalled conversations in which Phil expressed fear, not fear of scandal, but fear of chaos. He wanted peace. He wanted normalcy, and he believed that enduring a little longer might still restore both. Professionally, the pressure didn't stop. NewsRadio demanded long hours. Voice work for The Simpsons continued. Hartman's calendar was full. But emotionally, he was retreating. Comedy, once a refuge, became another obligation. He showed up, he delivered, and then he went home to a situation he could not script his way out of. There were moments, small, telling moments that now feel like warnings. Friends described Bryn's jealousy of Phil's success, her resentment toward his work schedule, her frustration at feeling invisible next to his career. None of this made headlines at the time. It lived in arguments, in raised voices, in silences that stretched too long. Phil tried to manage it the way he managed everything else. Quietly, privately, without drama. He didn't seek help publicly. He didn't expose the situation. He believed that discipline and time could solve what emotion could not. But addiction, resentment, and untreated instability do not respond to patience. They escalate. By the spring of 1998, those close to the Hartmans sensed something was wrong. Not imminent danger, but imbalance. A sense that the ground beneath the family was shifting. And yet, no one imagined where it would lead. Because from the outside, Phil Hartman still looked like the safest man in Hollywood. In the weeks leading up to Phil Hartman's death, there were no dramatic announcements, no public breakdowns, no obvious signals that catastrophe was imminent. What existed instead were subtle shifts, changes in tone, behavior, and routine that only gained meaning in hindsight. Phil continued working. He showed up to set on time. He recorded voice lines. He joked with colleagues in the familiar, controlled way people had come to expect. To most of the world, nothing appeared wrong. But privately, the weight he carried was growing heavier. Friends later recalled that Phil had begun speaking more openly about his marriage. Not in anger, but in exhaustion. He talked about fear for his children, fear of instability, fear that things were slipping beyond repair. He had started to consider separation, something he had resisted for years. The idea wasn't impulsive. It was careful, measured, and, in his mind, necessary. At home, the atmosphere was tense. Arguments were no longer rare interruptions. They were part of the rhythm of daily life. Bryn's behavior, according to later accounts, had become increasingly unpredictable. Periods of calm were followed by intense emotional swings. There were moments of reconciliation, followed quickly by suspicion and rage. The house no longer felt like a place of rest. One detail would later stand out with disturbing clarity. Phil had told at least one friend that if things didn't improve, he planned to leave. Not dramatically, not publicly. He intended to protect his children and remove himself from what he perceived as a dangerous environment. The decision was not yet executed, but it existed. And decisions like that, once spoken aloud, can shift the emotional balance inside a fragile relationship. The final week passed without incident visible to the outside world. No canceled shows, no emergency calls, just routine, work, home, silence. The kind of normalcy that can be deceptive, especially when tensions are building beneath it. The final 24 hours of Phil Hartman's life did not unfold like a countdown. There was no sense of urgency, no visible warning that time was running out. It moved forward quietly, almost invisibly, shaped by routine and familiarity, the very things that make danger hardest to recognize. The evening of the 27th of May, 1998, began like many others. Phil and Bryn went out together, spending time at a restaurant and later at a friend's home. There was alcohol, conversation, laughter that, to outsiders, appeared ordinary. No one reported a scene. No one sensed that the night would end in tragedy. To those who saw them, they looked like a couple navigating yet another imperfect evening. Nothing more. Sometime later, they returned to their house in Encino. The children were already asleep. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of suburban stillness that absorbs sound and makes everything feel contained. Inside the house, however, tension resurfaced. According to later reports, an argument broke out. What exactly was said remains unknown. There were no recordings, no witnesses, only the knowledge that the conflict was intense enough to change the course of everything that followed. At some point, the argument ended, or perhaps it simply exhausted itself. Phil went to bed. He lay down in the room he had shared with his wife, unaware that this would be the final act of his life. There is no evidence he expected violence, no indication that he believed he was in immediate danger. He fell asleep. In the early hours of the morning, while the house remained dark and silent, Bryn Hartman retrieved a firearm. The children were still asleep in their rooms. Phil was still in bed. According to police reports, he was shot multiple times while asleep. He never woke up. He never had a chance to react. The moment was swift, final, unreversible. Afterward, the night did not end immediately. Bryn left the house. She went to a friend's apartment. There, she confessed what she had done. The friend did not believe her. The idea was too extreme, too impossible to accept as reality, Bryn insisted. Eventually, authorities were contacted. By the time police returned to the Encino home, hours had passed. Inside, they found Phil Hartman dead in his bed. The scene was quiet. The children were unharmed, still asleep, protected by walls that had absorbed the violence only rooms away. As officers secured the house and began documenting the scene, Bryn returned. Shortly after, she died by suicide. By sunrise, the facts were clear, but understanding was not. A beloved performer had been killed in his sleep. A family had been destroyed in a single night. And a story that defied every expectation Hollywood had about safety, success, and stability was now impossible to ignore. What remained were questions about warning signs, about responsibility, about whether this tragedy could have been prevented or whether it was the inevitable end of pressures that had been building, unseen, for years. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, the story of Phil Hartman's death entered a new phase one, defined not by emotion, but by investigation. Police statements were released, timelines were reconstructed, toxicology reports were requested, and almost immediately, the tragedy expanded beyond a private family collapse into a public reckoning. Authorities confirmed what the early headlines had already suggested. This was a murder-suicide. There was no evidence of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. The sequence of events, as reconstructed by investigators, pointed to an act carried out while Phil was asleep, followed hours later by Bryn's own death. The children, physically unharmed, were placed in the care of relatives. But clarity did not bring closure. It opened the door to debate. Toxicology results revealed substances in Bryn Hartman's system, including alcohol, cocaine, and antidepressant medication. The combination immediately raised alarms among medical professionals and mental health advocates. Questions followed quickly. Was she properly monitored? Had warnings been ignored? Did the interaction of substances play a role in impaired judgment or emotional instability? These were not abstract questions. They were personal, uncomfortable, and deeply polarizing. Some framed the tragedy as a preventable failure of treatment, of intervention, of systems meant to protect families from exactly this kind of collapse. Others cautioned against oversimplification, warning that chemical explanations alone could not account for the emotional complexity of what had happened inside that house. Then came the controversy that refused to fade. In the weeks after Phil's death, attention shifted toward the circumstances surrounding Bryn's relapse. Rumors circulated. Names were mentioned. One in particular became impossible to avoid. Accusations, some direct, others implied, suggested that a fellow comedian had reintroduced Bryn to cocaine months earlier, after a period of sobriety. The allegation ignited a public feud, drawing in grief, rage, and unresolved guilt. What followed was not an official investigation, but a cultural one. Interviews, confrontations, stories retold from different angles. For some, assigning blame offered a sense of order in the aftermath of chaos. For others, it felt like an act of desperation, an attempt to locate a single cause in a tragedy built from many. Meanwhile, Phil Hartman's colleagues mourned in private. Memorials were held quietly. Sets remained dark. Scripts were rewritten. NewsRadio faced an impossible decision: how to continue without the man who had anchored its tone and balance. When the show returned, it did so cautiously, acknowledging absence rather than replacing it. Public discussion slowly shifted from what happened to what it meant. Conversations about domestic violence, addiction, and mental health grew louder. The idea that success could insulate someone from tragedy was exposed as a myth. Phil Hartman had done everything right by Hollywood standards, worked hard, avoided scandal, protected his privacy, and still, catastrophe found him at home. Years later, the case would remain officially closed, but emotionally unresolved. No trial, no courtroom testimony, no final narrative that satisfied every question. Just a collection of facts, fragments, and voices still trying to make sense of a night that shattered too many lives at once. And as the noise of controversy slowly faded, one truth endured. Understanding what happened to Phil Hartman required looking beyond the act itself, to the pressures, silences, and choices that led there. In the months and years that followed, the noise surrounding Phil Hartman's death slowly receded. Headlines gave way to retrospectives. Arguments cooled into uneasy acceptance. What remained was absence, quiet, permanent, and deeply felt. On screen, Phil Hartman never disappeared. His characters continued to air in reruns. His voice lived on through animation, repeating lines recorded long before that final night. Viewers still laughed, often without realizing they were hearing someone who had been gone for years. In that sense, his legacy became strangely timeless, frozen in moments of wit and precision that no longer aged. But behind those performances was a life that ended far too abruptly. A father who never returned home. A colleague whose empty chair was never quite filled. A reminder that success, professionalism, and public admiration do not protect against private collapse. For many in Hollywood, Hartman's death reshaped conversations that had long been avoided. Addiction was no longer something that happened only to reckless stars. Domestic instability was no longer invisible just because it stayed behind closed doors. The idea that quiet lives were safe lives was no longer convincing. Phil Hartman was remembered not for scandal, but for steadiness, for being the person others relied on, for doing his job well, without complaint, without excess. And perhaps that is what makes his final hours so haunting. There was no dramatic fall from grace, no warning broadcast to the world, just a man who went to sleep believing tomorrow would come. In the end, his story asks uncomfortable questions about how much we notice, how much we assume, and how often we mistake calm for safety. It reminds us that the most devastating tragedies are not always the loudest. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the middle of the night, in places we call home. Phil Hartman made millions of people laugh by revealing human flaws with precision and grace. His final hours, however, reveal something far more difficult to face: that even the most controlled lives can unravel when silence replaces help and endurance replaces intervention. And when we look back at those last moments, not as gossip, not as spectacle, but as a human story, we are left with a fragile truth. The distance between ordinary life and irreversible tragedy can be shorter than anyone wants to believe.